Alrighty, it is 10 o'clock, so hi everyone. I'm going to reshare my screen in just a second. Thank you all very much for joining the session today. Really appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead again, as I said, share my screen, introduce myself, and we'll dive in. If you do have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We'll definitely have time at the end to address any comments or questions you have, so we'd really love to hear from you. So let me go ahead and get my screen pulled back up. I clearly clicked the wrong thing and made that disappear temporarily, but we will get this fixed in a second. Okay. Alrighty, so sharing slides, playing from start. All right, so today we're going to be talking about building supportive pedagogical communities and libraries during times of crisis, which is a very broad title. My name is Sarah Morris. I'm the head of instruction and engagement at the Emory University Libraries. And pedagogical communities is something I've been really interested in for quite a while. So I hope today that we can just unpack some questions and ideas around this, and in particular sort of reflect on the past year and sort of lessons learned that could perhaps help us think about our kind of teaching and learning communities in different ways going forward. Okay, so our just brief introduction and agenda. So one thing that I wanted to kind of bring into conversation today are some past experiences I've had. So I actually started my career as a museum educator, and I've had experience in K through 12 environments and also in higher education, working as an academic librarian now. And I've been interested for a long time in sort of thinking about how different pedagogical communities sort of form and develop and evolve in these different spaces, and if there's things that we as librarians can sort of learn and adapt from some of these other spaces where pedagogical communities can be really central. So putting all of that into conversation with the past year and the different challenges and opportunities we've had is something that's been really interesting to me and something that I hope to kind of share and explore with all of you today. So just a couple of guiding questions to kind of keep in mind. These are things that I've been sort of rolling around in my head for quite a while, and also that I'd love to kind of explore with you all today. So one is just how can and do pedagogical communities play a role within library instruction programs? And we're going to unpack some things around that coming up. Another thing that I think can be interesting to consider is how librarians can sort of learn and borrow from different sorts of pedagogical communities and how that can sort of enhance our own work. And of course, are there lessons we can learn from the past year about challenges and opportunities around building community that we could carry forward in our work? Okay, so very brief agenda. First, I'd like to just consider some things about library instruction sort of pre-pandemic, so different themes, challenges, opportunities, just to kind of set the stage. Since certainly none of that really went away during the pandemic, in some respects, challenges or opportunities were heightened or the conversation shifted around them. After that, we'll also consider library instruction sort of during and moving into post-pandemic, again, challenges, opportunities, and next steps there. I'd also like just to consider some future ideas and possibilities that you might can consider and take back into your own library. And then, of course, we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. All right. So unpacking some things about library instruction kind of more generally. Library instruction has a lot of opportunities and great things about it, but also a lot of challenges. I could spend probably the whole session going over that, but we definitely have limitations with both, time with students and access to students and patrons. And I'll say I'm speaking from a sort of academic library standpoint. That's sort of my environment. But I think a lot of these challenges, opportunities, things we're exploring can also really apply for library colleagues in K through 12 environments and public libraries, et cetera. So I think if you say, one-shot instruction to a librarian, you get a very visceral reaction. It's a challenge most of us have had to deal with or are dealing with in our careers and in our instruction. So we just often have limitations on time, and sometimes just trouble kind of maybe having access points or connection points, say with students or patrons. For example, in the academic context, a faculty member just might not be interested in having a librarian come into their classroom, and so you don't necessarily have that access or opportunity to engage with students. There's also a lot of times a lack of awareness of what we can do and what we can offer as librarians. We've probably all had these conversations before where faculty just don't really know much about what information literacy instruction can entail, or not really sure what the sort of value or purpose of having a librarian come into their classroom can be. That can be sort of a challenge to overcome sometimes, getting people more aware of what we can offer. And the last thing, and this is something I really want to tease out during our time together today, is the fact that I think within libraries, it can be difficult because we're all often juggling so many duties. So instruction is often a part of our job. It might be a very large part, it might be a smaller part, but most of us wear a lot of different hats. We have a lot of different things going on. So it can be difficult to sort of focus on instruction duties among all these other demands we have. Instruction work can also be isolating sometimes as well. You might be, lesson planning on your own, you're teaching the class on your own. And so that's where I think considering opportunities for building community and establishing connection can be really important, and something that we can perhaps take inspiration or draw from other sort of pedagogical community environments, such as K through 12 examples from the museum world, things of that nature. But that last point is definitely something I want to sort of come back to today. So not to leave it on a negative note there's also a lot of opportunities with library instruction. We do have a lot of, I think, ability to often experiment with different ways of doing things. For example, a lot of librarians were not necessarily subject to sort of, maybe a departmental curriculum guides or standardized testing or things of that nature. So I see all sorts of amazing things my colleagues are doing, and people, across the profession experimenting with different ways of doing workshops, of creating online content, even before the pandemic. Of just delving into different sorts of subjects, finding different ways to reach our audiences. So there can be a lot of, I think, rich opportunities for experimentation, flexibility with how we can approach our instruction work, and partnership opportunities as well. In some respects, it can be challenging because we don't necessarily have, say, a whole semester class always to get to know students. But on the flip side, there can be, different ways to engage, freedom being outside of that classroom environment sometimes to establish different sorts of partnerships. So that flexibility and that experimentation, I think, is something that can be seen as a good opportunity and something that we can consider in coming slides. Okay. So, of course, there is then library instruction sort of during the pandemic. And again, we could spend an entire hour talking and unpacking and untangling that and talking about challenges and different things that have occurred. But I endeavored to sort of boil this down to a few key points in the spirit of thinking about communities coming up. So the pandemic, of course, posed a lot of challenges with community, connection, with teaching and learning. We all were grappling with distance from our patrons and communities. A lot of us, went fully online with our instruction. A lot of us were working from home for a year plus. And, I think libraries are historically have been and still are spaces where people can come together and form community and connect and engage. And so it was definitely, I think, a challenging time for all of us to not have that space to have that distance. We also had a lot of distance from one another, and this is something I thought a lot about over the past year, and we'll definitely kind of explore more coming up, sort of ways we tried to sort of mitigate some of this. But just, again, working from home, being out of the office, teaching online, doing everything online, definitely posed a lot of challenges for, our relationships with colleagues or instruction programming, things of that nature. I think all of us had to really rethink library instruction as well. How we're offering it, how we're connecting with people, opportunities for still doing certain kinds of things. A lot of us who might have taught mostly in person before, we're suddenly having to flip everything online. So again, you've all been there, we've all been experiencing this, but I think it's worth just acknowledging these are all significant challenges. And the pandemic also compounded a lot of our existing challenges, I would say, with library instruction. Getting, time with students and patrons, having people kind of know what we're about and what we do, being able to, connect with fellow colleagues, fellow instruction librarians, juggling all our different duties. In many respects, we had even more put on our plate. And so all of that definitely poses a lot of challenges to instruction programs, to library instruction, period. On top of that, if that weren't enough, there were also a lot of other challenges happening over the past year plus. Infodemic, a term I'm using here, has been, I've seen floating around in a lot of different places, but it's essentially a sort of pandemic of misinformation. And misinformation remains a growing challenge. It has been for many years, but it's particular things surrounding the pandemic, the 2020 US presidential election, for example. These are all, issues, the ongoing fight for racial justice, the massive political and social upheavals over the past years. And these are all major issues that would have been enough to contend with without a pandemic layered on top. And these are issues that I think are central to information literacy, to the work we do as libraries and as librarians. And we were contending with all of this at a time when we were also dealing with the logistical challenges of a pandemic and the distance factors and the navigating new technology. So it's been a lot, and it's been a lot to consider in our instruction programs and for our instruction. So in kind of, I think, grappling with all this during the past year plus and reflecting on this now as we're kind of starting to move, I'm sure many of us are planning to go back to campuses or maybe back to more in-person instruction coming up in the fall, is the real importance of building community. So I think I'd like to note here that I think community is really central to helping to tackle all of these challenges, both old and new, and making the most of opportunities with library instruction. And back to my earlier point about how difficult it can be sometimes for instruction librarians, we're juggling a lot of different hats. The work can be isolating sometimes. Being really intentional and purposeful about carving out spaces for community and ensuring those connections are there, I think can help us all really take the time to, reflect on some of these challenges, to explore ideas together, and to just, tackle these things within our work. So what I'd like to do now is unpack just some examples and ideas around building community. Some of these are going to be things from my institution from the past year. I'm sure a lot of you have been doing very similar things, and I'm excited to hear from you in chat at the end if you have ideas or things or successes you'd like to share, or things that didn't work as well. I will say up front before we get into some of these examples that some of the stuff didn't work that well. We had a lot of failures, things that didn't go well, some things that probably aren't really revelatory, but I think became really important and central over the past year. And so I'm going to endeavor to highlight some of these things and sort of put them in conversation with some ideas from outside of libraries as well around pedagogical communities, which is where I kind of got a lot of inspiration over the past year. All right. So in exploring these ideas, I'd say there's definitely some older approaches, perhaps with a new twist, maybe new technology involved. And I'd say some new opportunities sort of emerging from the past year in the midst of all of those challenges of really thinking about, what information literacy can be, what library instruction can be in our society, how to kind of contend with some of the distance factors and things of the pandemic. I think within all of that, there were definitely some opportunities for library instruction that can hopefully continue in the future. Okay. So the first thing I wanted to kind of delve into some is actually leaning into technology and using it to stay connected. And where I kind of started getting some inspiration from here or from some past experiences I've had in sort of museum education or sort of K through 12 environments. And what always struck me about those environments is how sort of central training, team building, professional development was to those spaces. It just was sort of a part of the environment, a part of the work. There was, often days or hours or chunks of time sort of set aside for those kind of connections and conversations where teachers could come together and share experiences and work together. The same thing happened when I was in museum education spaces. And I've always found that really I think empowering and valuable, and something that has a lot of potential within library spaces as well. So that's where I was drawing some inspiration. So in terms of using technology, again, to stay connected, at my library in the past year, we really started experimenting a lot with just scheduling like drop-in sessions on Zoom. Again, not the most revelatory idea, but just trying to be intentional about carving out time, whether every other week or once a month, just to have a space where people could come and just start talking about instruction. Was there something that went well for you, the past week? Do you have a challenge? Do you have a question? Sometimes these were attended by lots of people. Other times, maybe only 3 or 4 people would come. But I think just having that space dedicated to talking and staying connected around instruction was definitely important, and something that was worth deliberately scheduling, since we were all working from home and didn't necessarily have those opportunities to, say, go for lunch or coffee or just run into each other in a hallway and have a conversation. So that has been, I think, something that has been, successful over the past year, and that I'll talk about in a bit, ways to kind of continue and further that even once we go back in person. But yeah, leaning into that technology and just trying to have those regular sessions just to talk freely. And these, again, were meetings with no agenda. It's just anyone could come, just share ideas, talk, unload if you're having a rough time, which I think was really important during a year where I think a lot of us felt isolated and a lot of us felt maybe disconnected from communities. Another thing we tested out at my institution, I'm sure a lot of you did the same, is dedicated sort of training time. In the summer of 2020, we did a lot of workshops just internally for librarians around online pedagogy, around flipped instruction models, and just trying to explore ideas to help people get ready for a very unusual fall. We came back together in the winter as well for the same thing, to again train. And we have some scheduled for this summer too. And I think it's been nice, again, just to have that dedicated time to unpack a topic together, to explore ideas, to maybe have some workshop time and just come together around that. We're all swamped and we all have busy schedules, but sort of, again, being sort of intentional and then setting up that space where those things can happen, and leveraging the technology to help us do that was, I think, really valuable over the year, and something I hope to sort of take and continue going into the next year. The last thing that we kind of played around with some, and again, I'm sure a lot of you did as well, is even just having some co-working sessions. I know people would sometimes just get into small groups on, a Zoom room or whatever, and maybe lesson plan together. We definitely had people, this happened a little more early on, I think, as we all got more used to Zoom, it was a little less necessary, but setting up times to maybe test out something. Zoom, maybe you wanted to do a new activity or you were worried about setting up breakout rooms for the first time. And so just having people willing to kind of get on in those spaces, test things, sort of co-work and workshop things out together, since we were all grappling with a new tool and technology. So again, having kind of the opportunity and space to do that together was, I think, really, important and valuable as well, and helped us kind of maintain and even in some respects grow community during a year where we were all very separate and weren't in the office together. So another kind of brand that I wanted to sort of unpack here is around, teaching support. And I kind of touched upon this some on the previous slide. But again, over this past year of thinking about, challenges around library instruction with the pandemic, with the infodemic, with all sorts of different things happening and how we were doing our teaching. There was definitely, I think, trying to be, again, intentional about perhaps offering up space for experimentation, testing out ideas and activities, which I touched upon in the last slide, but making sure people knew there was that space for, testing things out and having that support. Using a new technology or platform can, I know, be nerve-wracking sometimes, and so making sure people felt hopefully confident going into their instruction. With that vein, we also had people providing like backup support on Zoom or leaning into co-teaching. I know some colleagues co-taught more than they had normally just because of, the online environment. Sometimes it's nice to have a backup support there. And I definitely got, we were taking inspiration from peer observation models and programs that a lot of libraries run to great effect. And there's a lot of great literature out there about that. But, a lot of those examples are predicated on sort of an in-person experience. You're observing someone in a classroom and maybe providing them feedback, or you're co-teaching in person. And so sort of what does that look like online? How does that look? One thing that I thought was interesting is, I was able to co-teach a few times with colleagues, but, often if you would do that in person, you maybe co-teach a session, you're kind of talking on the way out, you go on to your other tasks or duties for the day and get swept up in that. But since, you're in this online space and you all leave the meeting, we would set up a deliberate sort of debrief meeting afterwards because we needed to do something on Zoom. But it was actually a nice kind of extra step to take that I think sometimes can get lost just in the day-to-day shuffle of doing your work, or you just don't have time to really follow up or think about that. So again, back to that theme of, I think, sort of Zoom and the distance almost forcing us to be a little more intentional about scheduling space to debrief, scheduling time for connection, community, reflection, things like that. So that was something that came up a lot, and sort of just offering teaching support to one another and kind of building community. And we were on the same boat with being, new to Zoom, new to online teaching in a lot of respects. So I think that also was, again, a way to sort of lean in and foster community where people were sharing ideas, testing things out, and providing that support to one another, which, again, something I hope to, draw inspiration from and keep continuing in future semesters. One sort of last kind of area I wanted to unpack here some is just partnerships and collaborations. So, we mentioned before, challenges around library instruction with, juggling lots of duties, maybe not having time to reflect or engage, during the pandemic, challenges with distances and things. But there's also that challenge of sometimes people not knowing what we do, what we're about, and then dealing with a year that I think had a lot of things come up that caused us to think about, what are we doing in our classrooms? What is information literacy about? What can library instruction be? So I think during the pandemic, this opened up some interesting possibilities for conversations and opportunities for engaging with partners. This is, I will say, out the gate, we had mixed results with this sometimes. I had colleagues who said my department went on radio silence and basically didn't talk to me for a year. I had other people who had all these new opportunities for engagement, and we're getting really deeply connected with different partners. So the mileage can vary. But I think the overall spirit was to, again, just start exploring new methods and options for instruction. In some respects, we had to. In some respects, I think it sort of behooved us to over this past year. And then sharing those, options with faculty, with partners where we could to, I think, in some respects, people were able to open up new conversations about what library instruction could be, or what could this look like for this program, or how could we engage, how can we mix in, different online resources and spaces, asynchronous options, synchronous options, it's on and on. This also, I think, led to ways to highlight our expertise with partners and colleagues. I know this was something a lot of my colleagues and I really tried to lean into heavily this past year, going sort of out of our way to communicate where we could. If we were having issues connecting with each other, it was even more compounded with some of our departments and just, again, not being on campus together, dealing with all of these challenges. So really going out of our way to seek out opportunities to share with faculty, share with colleagues across the campus, kind of what we're doing, what we're exploring, how we can work together. Faculty were also having to experiment and rethink instruction as well. So in some respects, I think it almost kind of reset and opened up the conversation in a way to maybe get engaged in different ways. Some things that came out of this at my institution, at least, that I thought would be worth sharing are we have a Center for Faculty Development. A lot of you probably have something similar. Maybe it has a different name. But a lot of librarians started co-teaching workshops with that center for faculty. And again, as a way to highlight our expertise as librarians to help people think about, information literacy this past year. I had colleagues who taught sessions on OER, which is another massive thing that I think really came front and center as people were having issues, accessing collections, and we had students all over the world and all sorts of different challenges emerging there. We had librarians going to, faculty training sessions that different colleges were hosting, and again, sharing expertise, creating modules on Canvas, which I know our colleagues at Oxford College did to great effect. So people just finding those spaces, doing that deliberate outreach during this period, and trying to, again, highlight our expertise, get conversations going. Sometimes didn't quite pan out the way we wanted. Other times, I think, has established really exciting new partnerships going forward. And this was something that I was really taking some inspiration from outreach trainings we used to do at museums I worked at. And just to briefly note what that entailed, a lot of museums will have sort of in training like service days and have K through 12 teachers come and do intensive workshops, share curriculum, things like that. On the one hand, it was a good opportunity for, say, the museum to, share curriculum, share resources, etc. But I think the real value of it was the fact that you were getting different educators and people in a room together to share ideas and establish partnerships and learn from one another. And I think that spirit really came into play with people thinking about ways to connect with, say, their departments, with their faculty, and broadening out those pedagogical communities to include not just instruction librarians, but maybe grad student instructors, faculty, partners at our faculty development center, and getting all these conversations going. Because again, in many respects, we were all dealing with, a lot of the same challenges. We're all having to go online. A lot of us are working from home. We're all distant from our students. And so if that sort of leveled the playing field, so to speak, of us needing to explore and connect with one another. So that was, I think, another kind of angle and aspect of community building that became important as the year progressed, and something we definitely hope to continue in the future. Okay. So that all said, there were, a lot of different, again, approaches to trying to be intentional with time, with space to connect and build community, whether internally, whether reaching out to external partners. I'm trying to get time to reflect on new ideas, to test out new approaches together. So I think all of that was really bubbling up over the last year, and just, again, reinforcing how central connection and community can be to instruction, to pedagogy, to library instruction programs. So what I'd like to do now is just to consider some future ideas, ways to kind of take some of those strands, things that might have emerged this past year, and consider ways to sort of continue that going forward, especially as we're all, I think many of us, starting to go back on campus, starting to transition back to in-person teaching. Are there things we can take from this past year to help us continue to foster communities? So one thing to highlight here is just thinking about connections with a broader library community and continuing to leverage some of these new technologies. So to kind of unpack this some. I think a lot of our, now that Zoom, for instance, has become, I think, more normalized, or Teams, et cetera, whatever tool you're using, leaning into that to continue fostering connection and community. And this can involve colleagues across institutions, and I'll explain that social club model in a second, and even across campuses. This is something that's come up for us a lot. At my institution, for instance, we have campuses in different cities, and people spread out across libraries. Sometimes that can make it really challenging to come to, say, like an in-person gathering, maybe a lunch and learn session, things like that. So I'm hoping that with, again, Zoom and some of these new technologies that we've used to great effect in many respects over the past year, to lean into that, to continue having these community spaces where we can connect with a lot of people. An inspiration item here I just wanted to flag is I used to work at the University of Texas at Austin, and we had this program that a couple librarians founded called the ATX Librarians Social Club, adorable name. It started out as a Facebook group, and it was just for any librarian across the Austin area. And the idea was to bring together people from different kinds of libraries to connect. And we had a lot of people come. It was monthly. It was a lot of fun. But Austin, like Atlanta, is a sprawling city with a lot of traffic. And so there definitely was, a tendency of people who were perhaps nearby the meeting spot to show up. If you lived very far away, it was much more difficult to get there on time. And, you're tired after your long day. And just thinking of now that we've been, online, everyone's using Zoom, models like that can suddenly become, I think, really interesting when you sort of layer in that technology component as a way to foster connection. So I'm hoping, again, to find ways, whether my institution, to continue working with colleagues to think about ways we can leverage some of the technology we've been using to continue those community connections, drop-in sessions, things like that. To continue that thought, just definitely continuing, again, drop-in sessions, which, as I noted before, were agenda-free. People can come together and just discuss ideas, having sort of dedicated workshops around topics that are, I think, central and critical to library instruction. And as I noted earlier, I think we as a profession are grappling with a lot. There's a lot of major issues that have a direct bearing, I think, on the type of instruction we do on information literacy. And it can be really important to have the space and sort of mental space, time to work through some of those issues together. Continuing working sessions, things like that. And within all of that, again, embracing hybrid offerings as well. I mentioned leaning into the new technology, but even having maybe just being intentional about offering in-person or online options for maybe internal workshops and trainings or drop-in sessions, or having a mixture if you have a classroom that's set up to accommodate something like that. The main kind of idea here is I just think really to offer and advocate for dedicated time and space to reflect, to work and collaborate together, and to experiment with instruction. We have so much on our plate, and I think, before, I'm thinking back to when we were, I was at the office every day, my colleagues were in the office. The days can get so hectic, you're running around, it just can get really easy to not have time to, say, lesson plan, or maybe you want to try something out in your classroom and you don't have a ton of time, or there was that article you really meant to get to and you weren't able to do so. So I think kind of after having to be so deliberate about, say, setting up a Zoom meeting in order to connect, because otherwise we just, would hardly see each other since we were at home, to sort of take that, I think, that spirit and that energy into the next year and continue trying to be very deliberate about those community spaces. Some inspiration here actually comes from, I think, K through 12 environments. People I know who are teachers who have, say, these entire professional development days. It's just sort of an expectation as a part of the work. It's where they go to learn and grow. And I think, weaving that into our work as librarians, our work as instruction librarians, working with colleagues to set up those times and spaces, I think can be really valuable and important, and something that was really, I think, valuable over the past year in particular. And before I get to that slide, I did also want to mention, aside from, drop-in sessions, workshops, things like that, we're working with some colleagues in my institution right now to set up some reading groups around topics like anti-racist pedagogy, inclusive pedagogy, teaming up with organizations like our DEI committee and things like that. So I'm hoping that, again, there can be partnerships and opportunities to, again, carve out spaces for that reflection exploration. So just wanted to mention that as something that we're hoping to get going and take advantage of sort of moving back in person, maybe to have discussion groups, embraces hybrid opportunities as well, things like that. One other, I think, kind of idea for the future and something to take from another aspect of, again, community building that we did over the past year, which is a little more external focused, is to continue to seek out those opportunities to just highlight the value of our work. So engaging with partners in their own pedagogical communities. As I noted, I have some colleagues who, maybe their departments were kind of doing similar things, having maybe regular meetings. A department I work with, for example, started doing these kind of roundtable discussions for a few months. I think it kind of, people started going on vacation this summer, and so they're paused at the moment. But just coming into those spaces just to hear what, other faculty, other educators were grappling with and talking about, taking the time to either, co-teach trainings or attend trainings sometimes that maybe our faculty development center offers, just to hear questions people are asking. I think there's a great deal we can learn from people in other sort of educational situations. For example, people who maybe teach classes or teach different kinds of classes than ourselves and have those conversations with one another. So I think just thinking about ways to both engage with partners in their own communities, but also invite them to engage in our library communities to maybe open up those spaces for other types of educators that might be in our place of work, whether it's an academic environment or maybe you work in a school and you're connecting with teachers on different levels. Some inspiration here is just lots of different models for sort of internal pedagogical conferences. I know a lot of schools have faculty development centers that sort of host these. I worked at a past institution that did something like that every semester, but getting libraries and librarians sort of involved in those spaces and conversations. So we're part of this broader community, even as we're working to enhance and foster our own sort of internal library pedagogical community, I think can be really valuable and ways just to ensure we're being, engaged or communicating, we're connecting, and we're seeking out and finding opportunities to engage in library instruction work in different ways. Okay. So just some concluding thoughts here, and then would love to open it up for any questions or comments or ideas you have that you want to share. So first, I think that just, again, over this past year and grappling with all these issues and thinking about library instruction more broadly, is just finding ways to take advantage of some of the doors that might have actually opened up during the pandemic, in particular leaning into different kinds of technologies to help foster community or to continue communities that might have sprung up actually during this time period, is something I'm really eager to consider and think about going into the next year. And in particular, just being mindful of ways to bring in technology into community building in ways I might not have thought about before, instead of sort of defaulting to here's your brown bag lunch session or in-person session. Are there ways to have different offerings available to reach more people or to connect in different ways? So that's definitely something I really hope to consider in the next year with colleagues. Finding ways to deepen and further pedagogical communities sort of internally at our libraries and also, again, externally with campus and community partners. Back to that earlier question many slides ago, but thinking about sort of what it means to be part of a library instruction community and a pedagogical community. What shapes and forms can that take? Who can we bring into conversation? How can we connect with other communities? I think those are all really important questions to consider and things I'm excited to look at going into next year, because there's definitely been some, at least at my institution, some successes and I think new opportunities in that space that I hope to further. As noted, broadening what it means to be part of a library instruction community, finding ways as well to continue to highlight the value of our work and fostering those community ties outside the library. So using our engagement in community to, foster ideas, to test things out, and then to go on and connect with others is, I think, work that's been shown to be really valuable over the past year. I've had conversations with colleagues as we kind of wound down instruction for the year and just saying like how vital some relationships and communities were for us to really get a lot done or anything done in some instances. So finding ways to continue to kind of share and grow and strengthen those ties is definitely going to be, I think, worth considering in the next year. And the last thing, and I think one of the kind of most important takeaways for me, at least in this past year, is just carving out time and space to actually build these communities, to reflect on our pedagogy, to tackle challenges that directly impact our work and our field, to just have time to connect and share with other library instructors, with other teachers and educators, and work that can sometimes feel a little isolating or can sometimes get buried under so many other competing obligations. So being just very, I think, intentional about taking some time, taking that space, sort of working together with your colleagues to figure out what's going to make the most sense for all of you, what's going to work, what's going to be beneficial or valuable, and having those spaces sort of form and take shape in ways that are going to be really beneficial and help people grow and feel empowered in their own pedagogy. I will just say really quick, I'm fortunate to work in an institution with a lot of colleagues, a lot of people doing instruction where we can come together. I know that's not always the case in every library, so I think, too, it can be great to leverage different spaces, leverage technology to maybe connect with colleagues, just in your community at other libraries as well, especially if you perhaps are working in an environment that just doesn't have as many people, or maybe you are the instruction person, and so finding ways to form those ties, I think, is really worth considering as well. So those were just some concluding thoughts, some ideas and things I've been coming out of this past year, kind of rolling around. Again, pedagogical communities are something that's been really of interest to me for a while. I think it's a key component to library instruction programs that sometimes isn't always front and center, or isn't always considered as much as, say, the content you're producing or assessment or other topics that come up. But I think these communities, and I found, at least in the past year at my institution, played a huge role in helping, I think, us all develop new opportunities and methods for instruction, to explore and unpack ideas together. So taking the time and making the kind of effort and carving out spaces to have those conversations and connections is, I think, really central to a lot of our work in instruction programs. So that being said, I'd love to just open it up for any questions or comments right now. That's my email address, which I can put into the chat. I'd love to hear from you if you have ideas and things at your program. So I'll go ahead and kind of get out of the slide now and kind of just open it up so we can see the chat and talk. But if you have ideas or thoughts or anything you'd love to share, I'd love to just kind of open it up in our remaining minutes for question and discussion. So let me go ahead and pop out of that really quick. I will go ahead and stop sharing. Okay, great. So let me get the chat going. So yes, if anyone has questions, feel free to put them into chat or use anything there. If you have something you'd like to share from your experience with community building, with library instruction for the past year, would love to hear from you. So take a minute to see if anything's coming in. This is definitely one of the challenges of an online environment because you have to type your question. I think sometimes I do better rambling away and verbalizing, but anyway, take your time if you need to type something. While we're sort of waiting for if any questions are coming in, I will just say that I think a lot of colleagues are definitely working to put different modules or shared online resources together to share with one another, and that wasn't something I touched upon as much, but I think that can be again another way, aside from sort of meetings and spaces to discuss and reflect, to have shared resources, shared lesson plans, Canvas modules, guides, things like that. So that was something I definitely know a lot of my colleagues kind of leaned into the past year. It'd be great to hear if others were kind of doing the same thing. But yeah, definitely let us know. All right, great. So I have a question that just came in. Thank you, Angela. Sharing more about how you tackled peer evaluation in a virtual environment. Yeah, that was really challenging. I think often you could in peer evaluation situations, you go in and just sort of observe the person teaching. Some of what I know some colleagues did, and I have some experience with this, was having somebody come into a Zoom session as sort of like a backup. So, especially when we were all first started out, I think it was difficult managing chat, and you're sharing your screen and there's just a lot going on. So having sort of someone there is sort of a backup for the Zoom thing, but then to be able to just follow up afterwards and say like, hey, is there anything that could have gone better? Do you have suggestions? Do you have tips? Like, did you notice anything? I think that was definitely kind of just how we sort of approached that. It wasn't the most like formal or full-blown program. I know a lot of peer evaluations, you have very sophisticated, you're using rubrics and worksheets and standard approaches. So this was a little much more kind of, on the fly and ad hoc, but definitely encouraging people to take advantage of, hey, you get a helper with your Zoom session and that person can then give you some feedback on how the session went. Another way we sort of tackled it is in some of the drop-in sessions. I would sometimes have people say like, hey, could I use this time and space to test out this activity? I don't know if this is even going to work on Zoom, but can some people just show up? And so we did some of those where, we just said, hey, log on, pretend to be a student, help this person test their thing and make sure it's working okay. So we were able to, I think, get some feedback sometimes in those spaces too. Yeah, I think the informal approach sometimes, especially in, online, can be helpful and just, again, foster those community ties. So aside from, going into a session together, I think we definitely had people kind of gathering, and just in kind of drop-in spaces to connect or test things out. So thank you for that question. Catherine, thank you for your question as well. Did you have any virtual burnout or community building? Yeah, 100%. We definitely, I think, as the year went on, the reluctance to be on Zoom kind of grew, which I completely understood. And yeah, no, we definitely did as well. I noticed I would say in sort of the summer of 2020, we were really like, going to town with like, we're doing workshops, we're every other week dropping, because everyone was sort of frantically working on like lessons and changing things. And I think that the disconnect was sort of really felt then. As time got on and it settled, I definitely still, we made sure to have drop-in sessions. The attendance dropped off some, but I still felt like it was valuable to have the space for those who wanted to be there and to, have meeting times when people could connect and share. It kind of, I felt like it ebbed and flowed some. I noticed sometimes there'd be kind of a real lull and other times attendance would spike, or we'd have sort of monthly instruction meetings that had really robust discussion and a bunch of people showed up at. So it definitely kind of varied. I noticed, but yeah, I think we all definitely felt the burnout. One thing that I think was really impacted that I'm eager to get back to next year is socializing. So we used to have sort of, we have like a social committee at our library that just would plan sort of fun events with snacks and just get people to come and chat and hang out, which is great. We found it, in my experience at least, I'd love if somebody had success with this to share, but really difficult to translate that into Zoom, like having like a Zoom social session, and people were just not really into that as much. So that was definitely a community element that kind of, went a little by the wayside, but I found kind of like working sessions or kind of discussion around instruction was still okay over the year. But yeah, no, Catherine, thanks for sharing. Yeah, it was a little all over the place. It was hard to predict sometimes. As a brief sidebar, we had a similar situation with people running workshops. Some people had record attendance and other people, it was like pulling teeth to get anybody to come, and it varied some by grad student versus undergrad audience, but yeah, it was a little all over the road. So definitely hard to assess this year. All right, and Karen, thank you for your question. So are there topics you feel are best suited to the virtual environment? Yeah, so biggest struggle with virtual meetings is limited ability to have side conversations, 100%. It's great one-on-one, and then yeah, for us, a challenge with brainstorming. Yes, I have struggled with that this past year. I definitely feel like Zoom sort of lends itself to like almost like talking at people. And so it can be really difficult to have sort of, side conversations, things like that. One thing that we tried some in some of our like instruction meetings, things, not as much in the drop-in sessions. That was tended to be a little more casual conversation, which sort of went okay. But some of the meetings or trainings or things is actually just doing breakout rooms with people just to encourage some of those side conversations. And I went to a training this summer where they did this, and then I just cribbed it for my instruction for the year. So I will give credit to the other person. But having a Google slide deck that's blank. And so when people go into breakout rooms, have them take notes on like a blank slide. It's like group one, use the slide. Everyone takes their notes. It can work in instruction, but I found it helpful in meetings sometimes. You could get like shared notes out of it or get people to come back in the room and be like, hey, what was your side conversation? What did you discuss and explore? So that was something that I felt sort of worked okay. In terms of topics, I mean, we all just sort of kept defaulting back to what are we doing this year? Like, how are you dealing with this online thing or that online thing? Outreach to faculty came up a lot, different connections. So yeah, just trying to leave space for kind of grappling with some of those issues. It was a little more difficult, I felt, to do sort of maybe hands-on, like we're trying to do active learning lesson planning. That was a little more difficult, I think, to figure out in virtual environments. But that is a great question. I'd love to hear if you had any virtual meetings where the topic, you're like, yeah, this seemed to go well, or this completely didn't work. But yeah, that was the kind of breakout room, even in those meetings, was sometimes a tactic we employed. And I think it helped, especially if the meeting, we had some that were getting upwards like 30 something people. And so it's just really, really difficult to converse on Zoom that way, 100%. Yeah, so thank you for that question. I hope I answered that okay. If I can elaborate or anything, please feel free to put into chat. Let's see. Okay, Amy asked about the frequency of drop-in sessions. Oh, yes, great question. Sorry, I should clarify that. Yes, we did adjust the frequency. So in the summer 2020, we were doing them every other week. And then we had trainings throughout too. So it was almost like something going on like weekly to stay in touch. In the fall, I believe they shifted to, I think they were still every other week for a bit. And then we did shift to monthly after sort of the winter, and this whole spring, it was just like a monthly drop in. So there was that, and then a monthly kind of just instruction meeting where people could come together, and that tended to have more of an agenda and like, hey, come discuss this thing. The drop-ins were like agenda free to show up. But yeah, no, attendance definitely kind of dropped off some over time, which is totally fine. But there was definitely sort of a core group who like hung in there till the bitter end and came to all of them and were able to converse. It was nice that they tended to be from different libraries as well. So it was often colleagues who, you wouldn't see in other meetings. And so a way to kind of connect that way. But yeah, we definitely adjusted the frequency when the burnout started. And I think that's important to note with, community building. I mean, you don't want to like beat people over the head with it. I think it's important to, have the time and space to connect and converse and having the option there. But, sometimes people are busy. They're just not feeling it at the moment. And that is okay too. There can be some ebb and flow with that. But so that was something I kind of found over the year that was just important to recognize, or not feel like, oh, well, no one came. And I'm like, hey, you know what? Some people came, they found value in it. Let's keep making sure these opportunities and options are there for everybody. Awesome. Okay. Thank you for the great questions. Any other final questions or anything? All right. Well, appreciate you all sharing. Thank you all very much for being here. If you're watching this recording later, thank you for taking the time to do so. Again, feel free to get in touch after if you have ideas or something you'd like to share. This is definitely a topic I'm really interested in. I'm always eager to hear sort of what other libraries' experiences are, librarians' experiences are, what they're trying and experimenting with, and building community and connecting around instruction. So thank you all very much, and I hope everyone has a good lunch break. Take the Georgia Tech tour, which sounds really fun. I'm definitely excited to see that space, and we'll be hopping on that. And yeah, see everyone back later today. Thank you all again. Really appreciate it.